Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second video lecture of the semester. So we're going to talk about sort of a cognitive psychology perspective here, and we're actually going to integrate information that we learned from the trait unit, from the person perception unit, from the bio-neuro unit that we just finished, while integrating some information, basic information from cognitive psychology, especially about memory. And all this will culminate in a discussion about Alzheimer's. So I really love this lecture, and I wish we had time to do it in class, but alas, we're going to have to do the video lecture. All right. So I would open this lecture talking about Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. It was a movie, oh gosh, it was released some time ago now. It's perhaps 10, 12 years old and starred Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet from Titanic. And so I don't know if anybody has seen this film. I would highly recommend it. It's very clever and I think emotionally moving in a lot of senses. And so we'll sort of watch the trailer to get an idea what the film is about, and then yeah, we'll talk a little bit. Let's hopefully it plays.
I'm Clementine, by the way.
I'm Joel.
Hi, Joel. No jokes about my name. You like?
You look like a tangerine.
I want to be a great, big, huge elephant.
You're trying to figure out, did I have sex with someone tonight?
Isn't that how you get people to like you?
Here at Lacuna, we have a safe technique for the focused erasure of troubling memories.
Is there any risk of brain damage?
Technically, the procedure is brain damage, but it's on a par with a night of heavy drinking. Nothing you'll miss.
I'm in my head already, aren't I?
That baby's history.
It's all being wiped away. They're erasing you, Clem. You'll be gone by morning.
Whoa, careful.
What? Step back.
Roach the guy.
I loved you on this day. Please let me keep this memory.
The eraser guys are coming here.
Wake yourself up.
We're working like gangbusters.
I need somewhere deeper.
Can you hear me? I don't want this anymore. I want to call it off.
He's up in that.
Seemed to have lost him for a moment.
Oh, dear.
Are you sure?
I'm so sure.
Eternal sunshine of the spotless mind.
I want my mommy. This is sort of warped.
Oh my god, it makes me want to watch the film now. The film, of course, is about Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet, and they're in a relationship, and things seem to be going really well, and then the relationship becomes unhealthy, toxic, and eventually they break it off, and then Jim Carrey wants the entire relationship just completely erased from his mind. And and this is after Jim Carrey finds out that Kate Winslet's character has done the same, and then you can see the card here that Clementine Krasinski, Kate Winslet's character, has had Joel Barish erased from her memory. Please never mention their relationship to her again. And so it's very clever how they try to work this out in the film in deleting all these old memories. They say collect all the things that all the objects in your house that remind you of this person, and bring them to the office, and they show each object one by one as they record what's happening in the brain. So, anyways. We all have painful memories of people and events in our lives, and we sort of talked about this during our unit on psychodynamic theory and Freud and talking about repression. And generally, these memories are really hard to forget. The idea of repression, of being able to sort of push these traumatic memories into our conscious, is mainly BS. It's very difficult to do this. Usually, the harder you try to forget something, the more the harder it is to forget it. But ultimately, would it be possible to erase such memories as they do in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind? And if we can, should we erase such memories? And thinking about this question, it's a relevant question because some of us suffer uncontrollable memory loss, such as when people get degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. So how does the perception of ourselves and others change as we sort of suffer this uncontrollable memory loss? And maybe that will give us more insight into whether it's possible to erase such memories, traumatic memories, and whether we should erase such memories. What can the study of uncontrollable memory loss tell us about maybe the possibility of actual controllable memory loss? And so I link a nice NPR story here about sort of overview about what happens during uncontrollable memory loss, the changes in our perceptions of ourselves and others. It's a good read. I recommend it. In any case, let's get down some basic fundamental concepts, especially about memory. So what is memory? Memory is the process of encoding, storing, and retrieving information either consciously or unconsciously. As hopefully I have demonstrated throughout the semester, that things happen consciously. We're very self-aware of things that are happening, but a lot of things happen unconsciously, and we couldn't function on a daily basis without these sort of unconscious processes. So this sort of three stage process here: encoding, storing, retrieving. So encoding just means getting information in. Again, this could be consciously or unconsciously. And then once you get that information in, you want to be able to store it, to retain that information. Well, sometimes. sometimes you want to store that information. And then once that information is stored, then at times you want to be able to retrieve it, get that information out again. Let me go back. So sort of the analogy that I like to use is, you're sitting at the computer, you open a Word document, and then you type stuff in that Word document, right? And that means that you're getting information into your brain. You're actually typing out a Word document, and then you save that Word document, right? So you're storing it, and then hopefully, if you have a good organization on your computer, you can eventually retrieve that file again. And unfortunately, although we use the analogy of a computer being like the human brain, it doesn't quite work, because it's much easier to get information usually out of a computer than it is a human brain a lot of the times. All right. So there are three types of memories. that we also need to talk about. So once you encode and store and be able to retrieve that information, there's really 3 types of memories that you're able to encode, store, and retrieve. So first there is declarative memory, which is composed of episodic and semantic memory. And hopefully all this information hopefully sounds familiar. Hopefully you encountered this in introduction to psychology or gen psych class, or perhaps if you took cognitive psychology somewhere, you probably encountered these terms. Anyhow, so episodic memory is to remember events, while semantic memory is to know facts and figures, to know information. So you may be able to know a fact or figure, but you may not exactly be able to remember the point in time in which you actually learn that information. So episodic is more about autobiographical events. It's actually like sort of replaying a movie inside your head about things that actually unfolded in your head. While semantic is that you can pull out facts and figures. You know something. So it's you can know something without having without remembering when you actually learned it. Or you can remember where you learned something but forget exactly, sometimes you can remember while you're taking a test. You're like, oh, I can picture the book inside my head or the PowerPoint slide inside my head, but I forget what exactly was on that PowerPoint slide. But I know what the PowerPoint slide I'm trying to think of is. Yeah. And I remember sitting there and looking at it and studying it last night, right? Yeah. So we have episodic and semantic memory, and then the third type is procedural, which sort of stands on its own, and procedural is to do an action. To know how to do. Right? So we have to remember, to know, and then to do, or know how to do an action. So if we have, so I'm going to use these 3 questions in order to sort of test your knowledge about would this be an example of episodic, semantic, or procedural memory? So if I ask you, what does a pumpkin pie look like? Is that retrieving more of episodic, semantic, or procedural memory? So if I ask you to picture what a pumpkin pie looks like, this would actually be an example of semantic memory. So this is you know what a pumpkin pie looks like. And there we go. There's a picture of pumpkin pie with a little whipped cream on top. And at this point, usually there's about 30 people in the class that does not like pumpkin pie. And I'm sorry. I love pumpkin pie. I love pumpkin cheesecake. I love pumpkin anything. I may be basic, but I love pumpkin. All right, so if I ask you, well, do you know how to eat a pumpkin pie? That would be an example of procedural memory. It's how to do something. So knowing how to eat or how to drink, how to pick something up, that is procedural memory. And then if I asked you, well, can you remember the first time you ate a pumpkin pie? That would, by process of elimination here, that would be an episodic memory. You're remembering the events. And so the first time I remember eating pumpkin pie, I had my parents were just divorced, and I think we had just moved to the Chicago suburbs, and it was like around Thanksgiving time, and I think we were watching Clue in the living room, and I remember eating pumpkin pie with some Cool Whip on top, and it was amazing. It was delicious. So that's the first time I remember. I remember eating pumpkin pie. Whether that was exactly the first time, I don't know, but that's the first time I remember. So what brain areas are responsible for processing these types of different memories? And so we're going to focus on episodic memory and semantic memory because those are most important in discussing how we develop and maintain perceptions of our own and each other's personalities. So processing episodic memory is it's less complex than how we process semantic memory. So processing episodic memory, forming new memory, as you already know, the hippocampus is most important. And there's actually this sort of cycle that happens between the hippocampus and other areas of the brain. So as we encode memories in the hippocampus, especially the emotional content gets tied in with it, because the amygdala is usually active and the prefrontal cortex is usually active during this. All these processes are happening at the same time, but the hippocampus is primarily responsible for processing new memories and encoding new memories. And some of you may have heard of H.M., who was a man that suffered from very severe seizures, and so he underwent an experimental procedure in which they removed a lot of his brain, especially like 3/4 of his hippocampus, and then he could no longer form any new memories. His short-term memory span was essentially about, I think, 5 to 10 minutes, and then his brain just reset. He could not form any new memories. But the temporal and frontal lobes are also important for processing episodic memory. I don't want to dismiss that those areas of the brain do light up, but the hippocampus, if you damage the hippocampus, you're sort of effed in processing new memories. You retain all your old memories, but processing new memories, not going to happen. And so if you want to watch more about HM, I have a video linked here. We just don't have time to really watch it. We wouldn't have time to watch it in class, and I'm not going to show it now. You can watch it on your own. All right, so processing semantic memory, things get a little bit more complicated. Using a meta-analytic approach here, so combining results from, I think, literally hundreds of studies using tens of thousands of participants, Binder et al. Found that a distinct left lateralized network comprised of 7 regions was responsible for processing semantic memory. So this included the posterior, right here, posterior, inferior, parietal lobe, middle temporal gyrus, fusiform, and parahippocampal gyre, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, the inferior frontal gyrus, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and posterior cingulate gyrus. All right, so I'm just highlighting here. I'm not going to ask you to remember all these different, very specific areas in the brain, but as you can see, all the different lobes, except the occipital lobe, are extremely important for processing semantic memory, including the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the prefrontal cortex, and the limbic system, especially the hippocampus here. And so this isn't surprising when you really think about it. So if I asked you to think about what a pumpkin pie looks like, or what a baseball looked like, you may picture it in your mind, but you may also be thinking about, well, how does a baseball feel, right? How big is a baseball? Or if I asked you to imagine what a pumpkin pie looks like, you may think about, well, how does it taste? Not only what does it look like, but its texture, its smell. And so you're going to have many different areas of the brain activate when I ask you to think about just a simple thing. And actually, we have such advanced technology these days that we can actually map those ideas, those simple objects in the brain. So we have an idea of what the pathway in your brain looks like when you think of a hammer or when you think of a baseball. And so it is sort of possible to read what's going on in people's minds on a very fundamental level these days. But how easy would it be to erase memories of an entire relationship? So remember, in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, you had characters wanting to erase, every memory of a person that you have known intimately for months or years. How easy would it be to do that? Especially because memories of this person are going to be intermingled with memories of other people and other events. It just It seems like a daunting task. I don't know. I don't know if we could actually possibly do that. Like a very controlled erasure of memories of a whole relationship. I don't know. It just seems very complicated. I know, Duchess. I know. Yes. Sorry. Duchess is here. You may hear her here. But regardless of how difficult it would be to erase such memories, it seems very daunting. When we say that we are getting to know someone, like getting to know someone's personality, getting to know someone aligns with which types of memory, especially if we're thinking about episodic and semantic. Right? How do they sort of play into getting to know people? Procedural is not that important. Procedural memory is mainly controlled by the cerebellum. We won't. There's less information to talk about, but we won't talk about that. So if you describe a person as very nice, so if I asked you like, oh, what is this person's personality like, and you say very nice, right? You're retrieving a specific memory, right? So if you describe a person as very nice, is that semantic or is that an episodic memory? This would be semantic memory. Because you are recalling sort of a fact, quote unquote, about a person. That this is sort of a semantic, this is semantic knowledge about a person. Very nice. Which you have developed, that the semantic memory, this knowledge is based upon episodic memory. Right. You know that this person is very nice because hopefully you have spent some time with this person. Right. So you have had multiple encounters with this person, and so you're sort of recording, updating a database in your mind about what this person is like. So you've had these autobiographical events with this person, and then that has led to a sort of more summative judgment about what this person is like. So it seems like we develop ideas about what other people are like, what their personalities are like, based upon on our interactions with them. So it seems like our episodic memory then leads to a semantic judgment about a person. In the long run, though, is it more important to remember or more important to know? Is it more important to remember all those autobiographical episodes, or is sort of the overall judgment or summative evaluation of someone, is that more important? And how may this all play out when we have diseases where there are uncontrollable memory loss, like Alzheimer's. So let's talk about Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a degenerative disease, and so the degenerative disease is sort of the umbrella term, and Alzheimer's falls under this umbrella. And Alzheimer's disease is by far the most common form of dementia, or most common form of degenerative diseases. And they are degenerative because the brain actually degenerates. Like the brain starts to sort of dissipate. Just shrinks essentially. And so I know I showed this picture when we were discussing the bio approach, where we have the healthy brain on the left, and then we have the brain from an advanced Alzheimer's patient on the right, and you can see that just the brain mass, you can see it just degenerates, it shrinks in the later stages of Alzheimer's. So about 5.5 million Americans suffer from Alzheimer's disease, and as I said, this is the most common form of dementia. So about 60 to 80% of dementia cases are Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's typically starts around 65 years old. So I think forgot to look at this PDF before I started the lecture, but if I remember correctly from the facts and figures document here, that 90% of cases start at 65 years or later, right? Now this is like full-on Alzheimer's, where people can actually be classified, diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and that doesn't mean that sort of the symptoms cannot start earlier. And that's important, is to discuss which memories start to go first in Alzheimer's disease. So the first memories are actually episodic. So autobiographical memories, especially recent memories, are sort of the first to go. That Alzheimer's patients have trouble encoding, storing, and retrieving recent autobiographical memories. Although, and of course, the first brain region that's affected then, the brain region that's primarily responsible for processing episodic memories, is of course the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is dysfunction of the hippocampus was one of the first signs of Alzheimer's. Although, and this is really important, loss of smell is an early indicator of Alzheimer's disease, which can be experienced in people's 40s and 50s, especially to strangely peanut butter. And so I think to a third, to possibly maybe half of Alzheimer's patients report loss of smell before having like a full onset of Alzheimer's disease. So if you have a parent or grandparent that suddenly is having trouble with their sense of smell, and even though that we're talking about like serious difficulty in smelling things. As we get older, our taste buds and our sense of smell do deteriorate. They get worse. But we're talking about like serious difficulties. So the second memory system that is affected is actually semantic memory. And of course, if I ask you which brain region is affected, given the complexity of how semantic memory is processed in the brain, it all depends. And that's why sort of the semantic memory seems sort of random. Sometimes it'll be random what what Alzheimer's patients will remember or not remember, even though things that Alzheimer's patients have recently learned, that's the sort of the first knowledge to go to misremember. It can be quite random, depending on which parts of the brain that are affected. So you may have deficiencies in visual memory, or you may have difficulty in movement and coordination, or auditory things. It all depends. And so the third memory system that is affected is procedural. And so to know how to do things. And so, advanced Alzheimer's patients will have trouble putting on clothes because they forget how to grab things, how to put on something. And then ultimately, Alzheimer's patients, a lot of them die because they forget how to do some basic things like swallowing. And so a lot of Alzheimer's patients forget actually to how to eat and how to swallow, and sometimes they actually die from choking on food. And so the brain region that is affected here is actually the cerebellum. The cerebellum is mostly responsible for procedural memory, the thing that sits sort of below the occipital lobe and right next to the brainstem. So to highlight sort of what happens to our perceptions of our own and other personalities, we're going to talk about KR. And so I've linked the sort of case study from Klein et al., a case study that they published in 2003. And so KR is the person's initials. And so KR was, at the time, a 76-year-old female late-stage Alzheimer's patient. And so late stage, meaning that she could still communicate interpersonally. So if you sat down and started to have a conversation with her, you might not immediately notice that that she has some cognitive deficiencies, that she's actually an Alzheimer's patient. So it may take you a few minutes to start to suss out that she has Alzheimer's. She definitely had impaired episodic memory at this point, as well as there we go. As well as some deficiencies in her semantic memory as well. So if we look at KR's picture of a clock here, there's some trouble. There's some trouble in KR drawing a clock, right? So she sort of wrote, maybe started to write clock at the top. She looks like she wrote lock. She wrote the number 12, the 1, and then sort of gibberish, foo, mix, a good, hoping next. I don't know. So KR has trouble drawing clocks. So will KR have a stable and accurate representation of her own personality as well as other personalities? All right, so we're going to integrate some information, some material from the person perception lecture, as well as the unit on traits here. All right. So first, will KR have a stable perception of her own personality? So the researchers, Klein et al., gave KR a measure of the Big Five, and then 2 weeks later, they had her complete the Big Five measure again, right? Just to see, regardless of whether KR's version of herself is accurate, is it at least stable across a 2-week period? So they computed the correlation between her the first time she completed the Big Five measure, and then the second time, 2 weeks later, she completed the Big Five measure. So we're looking at the test-retest correlation here, and the test-retest correlation is 0.86. So it's very strong, very positive. So it seems like KR has a relatively stable perception of her own personality. Again, if KR's ratings of her personality at time 1 were exactly the same as her perceptions of herself at time 2, or that 2-week period, the correlation value would equal 1. Right? So it doesn't quite equal 1 here, but it's very strong and very positive. So it seems like KR does have a relatively stable perception of her own personality. And this is not looking at the individual Big Five factors, but sort of across the entire Big Five measure here. And then the researchers asked her daughter, KR's daughter, and caregiver of 2.5 years to rate KR's personality. All right, so now we have the daughter and caregiver rating KR's personality, so we're getting some eye data here. All right, so we have the daughter and caregiver being informants about KR's personality. And so we're looking now at accuracy. I was going to say, if the daughters and the caregivers' perceptions align with KR's ratings of her own personality, of course, the accuracy, the correlation value will be 1. And so, but if we look at the accuracy values here, the accuracy values are either, well, 0.31, so the daughter and KR, the daughters and KR's ratings correlated 0.31, which is moderate and strong, but it should be a lot higher given that the daughter and KR know each other intimately. So when rating close others, accuracy should be pretty high, should be strong, should be 0.5 or higher, especially 0.6, 0.7. And then the ratings between KR's ratings of her own personality and the caregiver's perceptions, that was only 0.11. Very weak. There are large discrepancies here between how the daughter views KR and how the caregiver views KR versus how KR perceives herself here. And when there are discrepancies, right, in accuracy, discrepancies between the I data here by the daughter and caregiver and the S data, KR, that discrepancy, of course, could be due to the informants, right, the I data, or it could be to the person who's self-reporting. It could be due to KR, right? There's a huge discrepancy here. Is this discrepancy due to the daughter, caregiver, or KR? And you're probably thinking, well, KR has Alzheimer's, so probably, if we're going to make a guess, this may be, the discrepancy here is more KR's fault. Right, so why were these values so weak? Why is there such a discrepancy here in accuracy? So one possibility is that KR's self-report data is based upon her pre-morbid personality, meaning her personality before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So could it be that KR got Alzheimer's, and because KR affects first episodic memory and then semantic memory, it is possible that KR has not been updating her database on her own personality. Perhaps she has gone through changes in her own personality, but because she has not been able to encode and store those memories, perhaps her database is a little bit off. The database of her own personality is a little bit off. So the researchers had KR's daughter and son-in-law rate KR's personality before the onset of Alzheimer's. So what KR's personality was like before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And the accuracy coefficients increased dramatically to 0.59 and 0.79 respectively. So when asked to rate what KR was like before Alzheimer's, right, there's much less of a discrepancy between the I data and S data here. That how the daughter and son-in-law perceived KR's personality before Alzheimer's aligns much more with how KR perceives herself right now. So it seems like KR has failed to update her own personality after getting Alzheimer's. Right, so just like a computer needs to update, right? Computers always have updates for you to do. Some are important, some are optional, but right. And we sort of unconsciously update our own database of our own personality as well as other personalities as we go through life, as we have more episodic autobiographical encounters with people and with ourselves. We may, of course, alter our perceptions about our own personality as well as other personalities. Right, so how will KR view other people's personalities? So we know KR's perceptions about herself seem a little off, but how will KR's perceptions of other people be accurate? So KR rated the personalities of the researchers, asked KR to rate personalities of her daughter and her caregiver, right? So, of course, KR knew her daughter before the onset of the disease, but the caregiver had only been with KR for 2.5 years. So KR did not know the caregiver before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So she was in the later stages of Alzheimer's with his caregiver. Right. So we're going to look at the accuracy coefficients between KR, who's now the informant, and then the self-report ratings of her daughter and the self-report ratings of her caregiver. So again, if KR, the informant here, if KR's ratings align perfectly with her daughter's or perfectly with her caregiver's, the correlation value will equal 1. But we may expect, we don't expect, of course, correlation values to actually reach 1. We expect them to be strong, especially between people who intimately know each other, right? But if we think about that, KR has not been able to update her database about her own personality in the past few years. it is likely that she has not been able to update her database about her caregiver's personality. So we may expect the accuracy coefficient to be weaker for the caregiver than her daughter. So for her daughter, the correlation between KR's ratings of her daughter and her daughter's own ratings is 0.65, right? Exactly what we expect, positive and strong. But for her caregiver, the correlation is only 0.18. So again, it seems like KR failed to update her database of others' personalities after the onset of the disease, right? If you can't encode new autobiographical memories about someone, you cannot then formulate a summative judgment about what other people are like. And if you can't encode autobiographical memories about someone that you know, that you have known, if you can't encode new autobiographical memories, then you can't update that database either. But given that her daughter's personality has probably remained relatively stable over the course of KR's battle with Alzheimer's, we expect that the accuracy coefficient between her daughter and KR's own ratings would still be strong and positive. Right? And so I want people to sort of step back here and think about the implications here, right? That you have people that are going through Alzheimer's and they're not able in the later stages to be self-aware of the changes that they are going through, right? That their personality is changing. Usually people in the later stages of Alzheimer's become more neurotic, less agreeable, less extroverted, less open. We see pretty systematic changes in the big five factors when we look at people going through Alzheimer's. And so people who are going through Alzheimer's patients are not self-aware of these changes, right? They may be at the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, but in the later stages, they forget how much they've changed. And so trying to deal with someone that doesn't realize how much they've changed can be pretty, maybe frustrating. And then if you have caregivers that come on, even caregivers that have worked with Alzheimer's patients for years, right? This caregiver worked with KR for 2.5 years. KR does not have an accurate perception of what their caregiver is like. And she may in the later stages not even remember who the caregiver is, right? And so the caregiver is intimately familiar with KR, but KR really has no good picture of what this caregiver is like. And how are you supposed to have some sort of working relationship with someone, right, when you don't know what the person is like? So it must be enormously frustrating for caregivers of Alzheimer's patients, not only because KR doesn't have an accurate representation of her own self, but KR doesn't have an accurate representation of the caregiver. And so as Klein et al. Say in their paper, there are no documented cases in which a person has lost trait self-knowledge, semantic knowledge, while retaining other components of the self. So it seems like, in the long run, it's much more important to know than to remember. That even though you may lose some episodic memories, those semantic judgments are most important for retaining perceptions of yourself and other people. So how can we prevent Alzheimer's? Or perhaps prevent Alzheimer's from early onset, right? And so some people are just going to be predisposed for developing Alzheimer's. So the heritability coefficient for Alzheimer's disease is 0.58. So about 58% of the differences in Alzheimer's are due to genetics. So there is a strong genetic component to Alzheimer's. So if you have parents or grandparents that have developed Alzheimer's, you are at greater risk for developing Alzheimer's, right? But that also means, right, around half, about 42% of the differences in Alzheimer's diagnoses and severity is due to environment. And so that means that you can that environment is so important that you can still impact both the age of onset and severity of the disease. And so there's this use it or lose it hypothesis, which means that that your brain is like a muscle. It needs exercise. And so if you don't use your brain, you're going to lose it. That you're gonna, if you don't use your brain, it's going to deteriorate. So it's very important to engage in mental exercises. And so this mental exercises could be something like doing art, painting. It could be doing a crossword puzzle. Maybe Sudoku. Sudoku. Oh crap! How do you pronounce it? Oh. Anyways, but it's even better when you combined activities that engage both your body and your mind. So things like swimming or aerobic exercise, or aquatic exercise. I'm sure there's a term here that I'm forgetting. Or dancing is very good for people, because not only are you exercising your body, which is very important, exercising your body helps create a healthier brain, but you're also working your brain by learning dance moves, or you're learning different swimming strokes. Anything that engages both your mind and body seem to be beneficial in staving off Alzheimer's or lessening the severity of Alzheimer's. All right. So not all is lost. You, especially you, most of you guys are relatively young. You're in your early 20s. I know there's some non-traditional students in my classes. And especially if we think back to the nun study that we talked about in the trait perspective in the trait unit, right, that we had this sample of nuns, right, that wrote personal essays when they were applying to the nunneries to become nuns, right, and they analyzed those essays that they wrote in their early 20s, right, for how cognitively complex the ideas were in these essays, and based upon the complexity of their writing in their early 20s, predicted to a large degree their chances of developing Alzheimer's as they grew older. So we know enough about Alzheimer's that the things that you are doing now in your 20s can impact what's going to happen when you're in your 60s. So you need to take care of your mind and take care of your body, starting right now, if you want to prevent debilitating diseases like Alzheimer's. And perhaps you've watched The Notebook, or a family member, a friend who has Alzheimer's, and it can be devastating to watch them go through it. So that's all I want to say about this lecture. I hope you've learned some stuff, and you can apply some of this knowledge to your own life. And yeah. Yeah, I'll end there. Goodbye.